everybody, what's up? This is Matt with the Geeks from the Multiverse podcast. With me is John.
What's up, y'all? As always, we're going to be talking about a very important episode, I think, man, right?
It is very important, John.
I mean, especially in the state of New Hampshire, because I know we are definitely, I would say, at least on the top 5 in the nation regarding this particular issue. Or just as, I guess, as a whole, right? Even though we're a small state.
Yeah, I mean, I think not just New Hampshire, obviously, but, across the United States, but not just in the United States, obviously. This is a worldwide problem.
No, right. But I'm just saying, like, in the United States alone, I mean, we're, like, out of the 50 United, states, right? We're definitely up there in this particular issue. I was just saying that, but yes, it is a global issue no matter where you are, depending on, if you're in Canada, US, Mexico, Japan, whatever. Like it doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day. Um, but what we're gonna talk about, Matt, is we're gonna be talking about addiction.
That's right.
And I know both of us, ironically, in the last episode, we were talking about how we met each other at a treatment facility. So it is ironic that we're now doing an episode on addiction, which it's I would say it's an important thing to talk about because unfortunately it's one of those issues that we see it on the news all the time. We may, see individuals talk about it, during let's say AA meetings or NA meetings or stuff like that, but at the end of the day, like addiction is a very serious issue. And, I know in my family, it's a tough one. It's not a light subject for some people. But I mean, for some families, unfortunately, like in New Hampshire, especially, right, heroin, it's a big topic.
And it's not even just heroin, because most of the time now you can't even find heroin. I think the biggest issue right now is fentanyl.
Well, right, but I mean, being laced with fentanyl or whether it's unfortunately like cocaine or meth or whatever it may be, they're just going to find it either way. But let's start off with this. What is an addiction, right? So, an addiction is when you have a strong physical or psychological need or urge to do something or use something. It is a dependence on a substance or activity, even if you know that it causes you harm, as well as it can and does impact your everyday life, right? So, even though we're talking about like substance abuse is really the kind of the main topic here, you can do, and it's weird, but like even exercising and like any daily activities, like video games, for God's sakes. I mean, that's an addiction, and most people are like, "Oh, that's not." I'm like, actually, it's classified, I believe, in the DSM, right? DSM-5, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's the latest one. Yeah.
So I mean, it's already been updated into the world now, and addiction itself is not. Unfortunately, it doesn't make any sense for people to not believe in something like this, right? Because anything that you do basically as an obsession, that is what an addiction is. I mean, it's literally you doing it every day. You don't realize the side effects. You don't realize the harm that you're doing, whether it's to yourself, to others, or wherever it may be. But really, if you don't think about it as, you know, as something that you really want to, you know, I guess really affect, not only yourself, but like, others. I mean, you don't think about that when you're doing it. You focus on that one thing every single time. And so it's not something that when you're doing it, you're basically tunnel vision. It's that the one thing you're like, I gotta go home and I gotta do it. I gotta make it happen.
Yeah. And we'll get there, but what's important to know about, what, understanding like what an addiction is, it's not necessarily like something that you have to take. Like, yeah, we're talking about substance use, but it can be so many other things, like we're talking gambling, we're talking internet, online, people addicted to their phones. I mean, you can walk around anywhere and I can guarantee you 90% of the people will never lift their head up from their phone.
I've made this joke because I mean, I am a part of this generation, but like, how can you tell when someone's a millennial? when they're looking at their phones the entire time and they don't lift, like you just said, like lift their heads up. They
Yeah.
just keep looking at their phones. And I mean, it's so sad that we're so technological based. It's great, but at the same time, it's losing that human connection, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm old school. I like to call people. Matt knows.
Oh yeah.
But I like to, talk to people in person or even over the phone or stuff like that. But when you have a text, it doesn't mean anything. It's not, there's no emotion behind it. But, as we're talking about addiction, it's important to realize that, you know, anything that you see or do, or even let's say, I'm going to say you might be a hypocrite because there's so many things that you may not think that you're doing is wrong, and you see someone else do it, and then you criticize them for it, and then you turn and look at yourself and you say, "Oh, wait a minute, I do those same things," but you don't think about it because you're blaming others instead of looking at yourself and realizing that you're doing the same exact thing.
And you may not be hurting anybody else, but an addiction doesn't need to hurt other people. You can be hurting yourself and it can still be an addiction.
Right? Absolutely. I mean, it's sad, but I mean, unfortunately, they're not seeing the bigger picture. Like they
Right.
only see it in the moment, and they only see that little small thing that they're doing. They're not realizing that the bigger picture is actually the part that they need to look at instead of just focusing on that one little thing.
So there's a whole science to this, and I'm going to try to explain this as I guess layman terms as I can, because this can get very complicated, and neuroscientists are still, you know, researching this and studying this. But there are, our brain produces a natural opiate 24/7 every single day from the normal activities that we do every single day.
Yeah, I mean, even you look at dopamine, right? And it's the happy, feelings that we get
Right.
in our
That's like
body,
the pleasure chemical.
right?
And these, natural opiates that we naturally produce in the brain, they're responsible for that dopamine kind of release, but these natural opiates, which are called endorphins, they have a lot of different effects, like decreasing pain. So if you've ever gotten, a cut or a scrape or broken a bone or something and it hasn't hurt right away, there's a reason for that.
And it also kind of feels like adrenaline a little bit too.
Well, that too, but there's a reason, because the endorphins are attaching to, your opiate receptors, and they're releasing that dopamine, which is causing these effects. And that's the natural process. So to kind of explain how it goes. So if you take somebody who, you know, really enjoys geek culture podcasts
Oh, what do you know? Geeks from the multiverse.
and they seem to find ours and they start listening to it and are really enjoying it, their brain's instantly going to start creating those endorphins. The endorphins are going to attach to these opiate receptors that are already in the brain. The opiate receptors are then going to release dopamine. Now, it's not going to be like excessive, it's going to release it sporadically. The more they enjoy it, it's because the more dopamine is getting released. And this is everybody that you've ever seen. This is the process that our brain goes through all the time. When somebody's at work and they're really enjoying their work, that's the same process. You have somebody who loves exercise, same process. This is the natural process. So when somebody now introduces, and I'm gonna use opiates as the example. Somebody now goes and uses, say, heroin or fentanyl. The substance that they're using creates a shortcut, and it forces the brain to now release excessive amounts of dopamine, and it floods the brain and creates this overwhelming sense of like pleasure, euphoria. And the only way that now they can get that same feeling is they have to continue using that substance.
Well, and it also seems like I mean, again, I don't personally know, but like, you're basically numbing your body as a whole, because once you release all those, like the dopamine, like coming in like in a rush, right? And you're trying to get that same, like almost like adrenaline feel. Like it gets to the point where you're so tolerant of however much is coming in, and then you need more. And you always need more,
Right. Right.
and
And that is exactly what happens. You do need more, and then over time your brain systems become actually deregulated, and I guess, like, in simpler terms, it just stops working. So the things that you used to do, so if you take the same guy who's listening to our podcast and is really super excited and he's loving it, he maybe got to episode 4 before he started using fentanyl. He goes to listen to episode 5, that joy is now gone. Like, the show is now going to be completely boring. It's not going to release any endorphins. There's not going to be a dopamine release. He's not going to feel that same level of excitement, and he's going to shut off our podcast probably midway through, because he's not getting that same level of excitement that he once got. So now he's going to go and get that thing that gives him that. And the brain is really one of the largest muscles in our body. And over time, it's going to start learning patterns, memories, and it's going to start learning, like, when these opiates come in, this is what we do. And a podcast, exercise, work, none of that is going to trigger a dopamine response, because that's not how we get the dopamine response now.
right. And I mean, when you look at the dopamine and how it basically, when I was just talking about numbing, it's like you get this person who, let's say this guy was very cheerful, one day, right? And then let's say the next day, this guy is like, he's like, okay, whatever, kind of like this, like Eeyore kind of like person, right? And you notice this, and then you're like, I mean, wasn't Jim over here like really happy? And then why is he all of a sudden like really sad? Because it's that that feeling and the emotions are just like taking over, and like basically creating a new person. Like when you were talking about the patterns and stuff, and that's what happens. And I feel like the brain is so intricate and complex, and it makes it really hard to, when someone stops, you're basically trying to, let's say, reprogram. I know we're gonna talk about that, but
Right.
it's like reprogramming that same individual to where they were
Right.
at that
And
time.
that's, I mean, the entire job of, your opiate receptors is to accept opiates. That's, I mean, and
I mean, yeah, you're right.
it's really silly, but they're called opiate receptors because they accept opiates. Our brain naturally creates them, but now you're introducing that outside opiate. And on one level, this does also occur using any type of substance. It's not just opiates, but it also, gambling, sex addiction, internet addiction, fill in the blank before the addiction.
Right.
It all does the same thing. When you do this thing, you're getting that flood of dopamine. And when the opiate receptor has nothing to attach it, nothing to stick to it, essentially, that's when you start having those cravings. That's when it starts sending those signals to the rest of your body saying, we're not getting what we need to release dopamine. So you need to put whatever you are putting in so that we can do our job. And this is exactly where withdrawals come in. So you might start with, having really, intense cravings, but sooner or later it's going to start sending more intense signals over time, where now you're getting sick, now you're shivering, now you're having seizures, and
Well, okay, Matt, since I know you know this, most people don't realize that the most dangerous withdrawals that you could have is from alcohol. And it's because, like he was talking about, like seizures, you can have, DTs, you can have all these things, and all of a sudden it literally could kill you, like in an instant. And so
Yeah.
when someone withdraws from heroin, it might feel like they're dying, but they're not going to die. I mean, like I said, it's that feeling of like, yep, I'm going to die, but it's like the coldness, the shivering, I'm itching my body. I'm doing all these things to try to get rid of this, but at the end of the day, alcohol is probably the worst thing that you can withdraw from, and that is why it is very. It has, like, when you go into recovery and stuff, like, that is the biggest thing that you need to look out for, because again, everyone's different in like their tolerance levels, and so on and so forth. And so, someone who might be drinking, let's say, 2/5 of Jack every day, you know, yeah, it's probably going to affect them a lot worse than, let's say, having a 6 pack, let's say every day or something like that, because the
Right.
amount of your
Yeah.
consumption, but, when we're talking, about like the substance side, it's hard to, I would say, realize that a lot of these things can be really detrimental. Not, of course, like when we're talking about like harming, just not only yourself, but the loved ones and your friends and your family and everything else that comes involved with this addiction as well.
Yeah. And it's really with these withdrawals that that's kind of where that cycle begins to recycle into, like, I'm feeling this way. The only way that it stops is if I use again. And when they use again, it satisfies what your brain is looking for. It soothes like the rest of your body because it's no longer needing what it craved until it's gone again, and then
Right.
you restart that cycle all over again.
It's the vicious cycle. That's all it
Right.
is. It's just a continuous cycle that, if you can't, get rid of that loop, then you're right. You're going to be stuck in this pattern, in this way of life, because at the end of the day, I mean, yes, you're potentially killing yourself. I mean, and
Yeah.
that's in the long run, but hopefully that doesn't get to that point.
Right. And dopamine, I mean, yes, it's as we said, it's the pleasure chemical, but it's also the it's responsible for reward. It's part of the reward system in your brain. It's sort of like if those of you out there that have kids, if you've ever given a kid a cookie,
Yep.
or those of you that may have pets, you give maybe I'll say a dog because Bucky's laying right next to me,
Yep. Yep.
but you give a dog a treat.
Oh, don't say that word, because he's looking at you now.
um there's instantly that sense of reward. Like, they have that sense of accomplishment, like, I have this cookie, I have this treat. Like, there's that sense of reward, and when they get that overwhelming dopamine release, it does the exact same thing. Whether they want to think about it as a reward is completely irrelevant, because it's more subconscious than conscious.
Well, it's also a temporary effect. It's not a long-term solution.
It goes away, and that's where, the brain's muscle memory kicks in over time, where it's that repeated. If you have kids, every time they clean their room, you give them a cookie, they will start cleaning their room on their own and come out and say, "Where's my cookie?" And
Right.
if you doubt me, try it, because they will do it. And I'll say this for my dog, Lucy. When she was a puppy, every time she went outside and did her business, when she came back in, we gave her a treat. Now that she's almost 15, immediately when she comes in, she's excited, looking at me like, "Where's my treat?" And she just has that sense of, I did this. Now where's my thing? Like, where's my reward?
Right, and you're creating those behaviors. That's really what it is. You're
Yeah.
creating the behaviors that, whether they're not is positive, it's in the long term, it's going to be more negative effects in this
Yeah.
case.
And in addiction, it's more of a subconscious thing where when you use it, creates that reward. So then your body kind of goes into the opposite negative effect of, hey, we need this thing, or I'm going to make you sick. And then you're sick and go, okay, well, I guess I got to use now. And then you kind of, like I said, vicious circle. But
Yeah.
what do we got next? I mean,
Well,
this is a pretty popular topic among geek culture, I think.
I mean, okay, my bad. See, and now I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about cosplay and LARPing. Is that what you're talking about?
That's definitely what I'm talking about.
So, in my personal opinion, okay, I know Matt and I we kind of discussed a little bit about this, but they do actually correlate with each other. So, like, you can have a LARPing event where let's say a Civil War reenactment, right? A lot of those people can reenact the situation, wear the Civil War like uniforms and everything else, and then I'm not saying they're going to go to a convention afterwards and do cosplay, but the thing is about it is like LARPing, you're doing things in live action. You're reenacting something, you're doing something at that time with, let's say, weapons or something like that. It's all, of course, pretend, right? And so
Right.
with cosplay, yes, you're wearing an outfit, you're wearing certain things, and you're at a convention or you're at something and you're dressing up as your favorite anime character or superhero, for example, and you get into that role and you kind of play them, right? And then you could go to a LARPing event where it could be superhero based. I don't know. It really just
You
depends.
very well could be. I mean, there are definitely, I think, are similarities between the two. I mean, are they different? I mean, obviously, LARPing, if you don't know what it stands for, it's live action role play. Cosplay is obviously short for costume play. Is it the same? One could argue, I guess, but I think it's similar in nature.
Right. I agree. I think it's very similar. I think it's very, unique in their own ways. But I mean, at the end of the day, when you're doing either one of these, it's really if you're passionate about what you're doing, right? Because whether you're LARPing, like I said, the Civil War reenactment, or if you're, dressing up as your favorite superhero at a cosplay event or something like that, it really comes down to, are you passionate to do what you do? Because would I do it? Absolutely, but I don't have thousands of dollars to make the
Right.
suit or do
Yeah.
something. But
I certainly don't either. But, why do we talk about cosplay? One, because individuals can experience addiction when it comes to cosplay. And it's very serious when it comes to someone's identity. They're essentially playing a fictitious character, whether they're playing, a movie character or a TV show or a comic book or anime character, they're playing a fictitious character, and it's their identities can get lost in translations, and it can quickly become an addiction. So I think very easily that's why we're kind of bringing up this topic of cosplay. Not because we're a geek culture podcast,
not at all, man. Not one bit, right?
not one bit,
Okay.
but it's very prevalent in today's society because I know I've certainly seen my share of the younger generation.
When you say younger generation, which?
Younger than you.
Well, that's good because I.
Yes.
Okay.
But I have certainly seen a fair share of the much younger generation.
Thank you.
Yes. Kind of go over the top with how much they're cosplaying, where I don't know where their cosplay identity starts and where their real identity starts.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie though. I've have seen on like videos and stuff. Like I remember one guy making like an Iron Man costume, and I mean, we're talking, 3D printing, doing all this stuff. And I mean, it was legit. But to put the amount of time, the money, and all this other stuff, like to create basically another identity, because that's really what I
Yeah.
feel like it is.
Yeah.
It's like another self identity, in the respect of, it's great to, let's say, like give you some charisma, give you that like over, I'm not saying overpowering, but like a, euphoria
I
feeling.
mean, it's that, getting the positive feedback. When you create, the perfect costume, you spend maybe weeks and months, mastering that character's mannerisms and movements, and you go to the convention and people left and right are telling you how great you look and how great, you are as that character. That can be a highly addictive experience.
Right. And I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, to put it in real like retrospect, is like you can spend all your time, you can spend all your money, you can do, the conventions and get the experience from it and do all this stuff, but like, is it truly gonna be like a make or break kind of deal? Because at the end of the day, like it's great to do all that, and and if you have friends and family that do it with you, like that's even better. But if you're taking away from the time, like from your family or your friends or coworkers or whatever it may be, you know, is it really going to be worth, all that time and effort that you put into this one thing? Unless you had somebody that was willing to do it with you. Because like Matt, I'm not gonna lie, if I wanted to dress up as Cap and then you wanted to go as like Thor or somebody, I'd be like, let's go, man. Like I'll see you in some like Thor Norse mythology kind of looking thing. I'll be wearing the whole cap suit with the shield. I'm like, hey, and I do that with you, but I'm not gonna spend a lot of hopefully not a lot of money and hopefully time away from my wife and
Right.
everything else.
Right. And this is, when you're starting to, I guess, neglect other areas of your life where, maybe you're missing work, or, your friends are, hey, you want to hang out? No, no, no. I got, I got to work on my costume and I got to get all this ready. You're starting to put off, your relationships, even, your personal relationships, where if you're married or you're dating or whatever, you're 24/7 into, I got to make this costume. I got to get ready for this. I got to, you're looking yourself in the mirror, practicing, your Wolverine stances, and how your claws come out. And, your wife is sitting there behind you going, you're a weirdo.
Like, thanks, I know.
And you have zero connection because you're 100% involved in this persona than you are in your
The reality, like the real world.
in the real world around you. And that's where, that's where the addiction can come into play, because you start kind of having this over reliance on cosplay, kind of as this means of approval and self-esteem, right? And then the lines between the character and who you are as a person starts to get blurred.
So another thing I guess kind of relates to this is like if you, for example, like I know Matt and I have talked about this too, but like when you play video games, right, you're escaping into another world in that game, whether it's like, let's say Elden Ring or um, Diablo or something like that, right? You're in your character, you're escaping for a bit, and you realize like, okay, I'm playing this. I'm not worried about what really is going on around me, like not having to worry about the stresses of life and all this other stuff, and you're escaping that moment, right? But like, let's take it into like a real effect here. But like, what he was talking about when let's say you're practicing your Wolverine, stances and the costume and how you look and how you do this. I mean, like you're escaping into this personality, right? And it it almost makes you feel like you have to be that person all the time to get that appreciation, to get that,
Right.
self satisfaction that you're trying to gain. Where, in a video game, yeah, you can do that for a little bit and then you'd be like, okay, cool, I got to go back to work now or I got to go do other things. And you don't have to like think about it. It's more of a, like you said, a subconscious, like, okay, yep, I'm good to go now.
Yeah, and then, sooner or later, like you'll end up finding yourself going to work as Wolverine, which it sounds crazy, but like people are doing this all over the world. Like they're actually, dressing in cosplay, going to their jobs. And I mean, you can say the line is blurred, but I don't even think that line in their life even exists anymore, where you can say, this is who you are outside of this character that you're portraying, because you can't see it anymore.
Right. And like you were talking about, like you're basically having tunnel vision. Like you're only seeing what's in front of you. You're not seeing everything else around you. You're not experiencing the moments in that, relative of space and, in that time frame. And when it comes down to, cosplay or LARPing or whatever it may have been, you know, it makes it harder to really like self-reflect on you. Like, and like you were just talking about how you almost like lose yourself, like Eminem, like lose yourself, in the
Yeah,
mood,
yeah,
But but it's true because like you almost don't realize like you're missing that part of you that made you who you are, and it's sad because like when you look at somebody and you realize like okay, like I'm going to use the example like I said, Jim, right? So Jim was this nice guy, he was happy, and all of a sudden he's like, nah, but just call me Logan, and you're like, um, no, your name's Jim, clearly. And he's like, no, just call me Logan. But he gets into that, and like it almost like he turns a switch, right?
right,
It's like you
right,
get angry because you don't want them to realize, like, no, that's not me anymore. I'm now this person, and that's who you are. And it's like, no, like, you need to realize, like, what is you? Like, who are you as a person? And
yeah,
making that sure that you don't escape always into this mode.
and it does, I from an outside perspective, like it does sound crazy when you're hearing this, but like people are doing this left, like all over the world, and like we'll take Jim or who is now Logan, like sooner or later he'll get so frustrated with the people in his life that he will disassociate with them and only talk to the people who are recognizing him as Logan.
Right. And that's where, and unfortunately, this is where hopefully you have a good support system, right? Because if people are buying into this and are like actually believing this, no offense, they're not your real friends, man. Like, you need to realize, like, your real friends are going to tell you, like, hey, stop acting like, Wolverine and start acting like the guy I've known for, let's say, 15 years.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
that's not who you are. And I think that, you know, that's where you have to realize, like, you know, spending the time with your family, your friends, whomever it may be, like that's important because hopefully those are the ones you're going to have basically give you a self check like, hey, man, there's something going on and I need you to, like, maybe help me out. And maybe he's not saying that, but like, hopefully they're like, hey, there's something going on. What is it exactly? And what can I do to help you?
Yeah, and a lot of people within, I think, the cosplay, realm or culture, subculture, whatever we want to call it. I think the biggest thing is, they find a community of people where they finally fit in, but they kind of get this feeling deep down that if they weren't that character, they don't fit in anywhere else. And that's like one of the biggest issues I think with cosplay that makes it so addictive is because we have this whole culture that, you know, you can be who you are, especially in cosplay when you go to these conventions and you're wearing a costume. Honestly, I think no matter how crappy it could look, you'll probably still get people who will go, "Oh man, that's awesome."
Right. And looking back at, what we've been talking about, it's like, it's great that there's a community, there's supporting in some ways and like that. But I feel like, again, if you do this, do it because you love it and that's great, but don't feel the need to have this as like the only satisfaction in your life.
Right.
You
And
know,
that's the thing. I think you have to find balance. Like you have to balance the cosplay with the responsibilities of reality,
right.
which is, the relationships you have, the responsibilities you have, and not make cosplay everything about your life. Strike that balance. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that you have to put it in its place.
And I'm thinking of a word right now that unfortunately with our society, we don't do this as often. And I'm going to say it, and it's the truth. Moderation, right? Moderation is so
Oh,
key. Oh, yeah, I gave you guys a blunt truth because it is
uh-oh.
true. Because it's so sad. Like when we think to ourselves, like, you know what? If I, for example, if I'm like, what is something I really want right now? Like if I was to choose, I'd be like, I'm gonna have pizza. Now I'm gonna tell you, I have I been known to eat a whole pizza by myself? Absolutely. Do I realize that afterwards it's not a good idea? Absolutely. But the issue is
Yeah.
like knowing that, okay, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have had the whole pizza. Maybe I should have only had like maybe a couple slices and then maybe like a salad or something like to kind of substitute that. But we realize that we overdo things. We over I would say like we over pleasure ourselves, and it really devastates us because then when we basically become impatient is really the key here, and
Yeah.
we become this like I need it now. Like guess what? There's things called you need to wait. Like it's not basically self gratification or instant gratification. Like it's you have to wait, right? And there's things in life, right? It takes time. It's not going to be like an
Yeah.
instant thing.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately with addiction, where it's this self gratification, this instant thing. And that's where we need to realize, like, hey, you know what? Like, I'm not saying like, drink, alcohol like every day and like, whatever. But what I'm saying is like, if you're doing, let's say, activities or other things like that, you don't need to overdo it.
Yeah. You just need to set, I think, realistic goals for yourself and learn how to manage your time effectively so that when it comes time for work or for family or friends, you still have that time. But when it comes time that you want to cosplay, you have that time too. But it's not, I'm just going to cosplay and everyone is just going to have to come along for the ride.
Right. And I mean, when you look at probably the biggest struggle in life is balance, right? And like when we talked about like self gratification and we do all this stuff, like balance is probably the hardest thing that you can probably manage in your life. Like whether your work balance, your life, let's say balance, your family, your friends, your own me time, whatever it may be, you know, it's so hard to like manage that. And, basically like we were talking about managing time, but the balance of life is of course the probably the biggest struggle we have. But to realize that at the end of the day, we only live in the moments and we only have so much time on this planet. So enjoy what you have currently and what you actually, are grateful for in your life, whether it be, your family, your dog, your friends or whatever it may be, right? Like accept that that's who you are, and learn that not everything needs to be, oh my God, this needs to be the only thing in my life. And this is the only thing that I can only live through, or basically, know, this is the only thing that is important in your life. Like it's not. There's so
Yeah.
many other things in it. But
I mean, just, throwing a personal example out there.
oh
I
boy.
mean, we're doing this podcast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, very easily, I mean, I could say I've spent a lot of time focused on producing, creating episode ideas, putting notes in, where I have to kind of take that step back and say, I've probably just spent realistically 3 days producing, creating, all the episode folders in Google Docs and putting notes in. And it's like taking that step back and going, you know what? I'm just not going to do any podcast stuff today.
I think you just admitted the first step, admitting you have a problem. I mean, it
But
sounds wrong, but it's
it's
true.
it's realistically, I mean, yes, doing a podcast, does it require a lot of work? Yes, it does. It I will say it requires a lot of work, but I am 100% guilty of putting my head down and just doing the work. And by the time I look up, it's like, how have 3 days passed? And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
No, you're
like,
right.
I mean, I haven't done that honestly, but I've spent hours in a day just writing show notes for, you know, 4, 5, 6 episodes at a time. And when I step back, it's like, I probably didn't need to do as many notes as I needed to.
Right. I mean, and I guess really the way we're going to look at this is like, when you're doing something that you're passionate about, you don't need to spend, let's say hours on end to do this. I mean, like, for example, like when Matt was talking about the podcast, like, yes, I'll admit he does do a lot of show notes and it is very helpful. Am I guilty of not, you know, basically, helping do this process? Absolutely. Now, granted, I'm not saying I have any excuses or anything like that. I know that I am busy and I know he's busy with stuff and he does his own thing and I try to do my own thing. But, you know, it's difficult when you have so much going on and like, you're trying to have this moment like we're having right now, like during this podcast, like it's it's our it's our like me time together because this allows us to do something we're passionate about. But yes, when Matt was saying like it takes multiple, let's say, days and on end to do all this stuff and like setting up the ideas and creating the content and everything else, at the end of the day, like the best part about it is doing what we're doing right now. Like, granted, it's like an hour long or whatever, but we do it because we love it, and
Yeah.
we're not just sitting here and just BSing the whole thing. Like it's because we're passionate and we're trying to balance our own lives and time with our families and our friends and everything else. But at the end of the day, going back to this, going back to what we're talking about, it it really matters when you have all these things going on in your life. I mean, if you want really the most out of it is like build those goals, build those dreams that you want to have. Because I mean, like I said, Matt and I mean, yeah, we would love to be, you know, top podcasters in the
Syndicated, baby.
city. Woo, yeah, like we'd love it, but at the same time, like we're doing this because we love it. And yes, we'd hope that, maybe one day when we do a Facebook Live, we don't get just one viewer, right? We might have like hundreds of people listening, but we're not just doing it because it is the only thing we're doing, right? Because we both have jobs, we both have our lives, right? Because I mean, I'm going to get even more busier with having, my son. He's going to be born in September. And I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not going to be doing this, but I might have to take a step back a little bit here and there, but I'm going to try to help him as much as I can, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, Matt.
So we got, we both come, obviously, like we said in the beginning of the episode, we both work together in a treatment facility, which was a residential treatment facility. But we did want to, talk about treatment and recovery. Obviously, talking about addiction, we would be doing a serious disservice without talking about treatment and recovery, right? Like,
Right. Absolutely. I mean, when we come down to, the different levels of treatment, right? Because I mean, usually the first step, depending on, let's say if it's like substance abuse, right? So whether you're, let's say withdrawing from, alcohol or heroin or cocaine or whatever it may be, like usually the first step is not always, but it depends. It usually would be, let's say, a medical detox or some kind of like what some places might call like a stabilization or something like that. And the reality is like a detox in general, right? Is a in a medical detox, nurses are usually giving certain meds and of course they'll meet with doctors and they'll meet with them and make sure that they're prescribed the right doses and stuff like that to withdraw more effectively as well as more positively instead of making them suffer. Now, the problem with the flip side of this with stabilization, where we worked at, there was a place like this. It's more of an immediate withdrawal. Like, and it sucks because they're usually coming off, let's say this person's coming off of the street and, depending on what they're using, yeah, I mean, of course they're going to get, let's say certain meds and stuff like that, but it's a lot harder. It's a lot harsher because
yeah,
it's
yeah.
more, they have to realize like they're going to have some pain, right? So unfortunately, medical detox, yeah, you're going to have some pain, but you're probably not going to have as much as someone who's going to be coming in and like dealing with the withdrawal, like the withdrawals itself immediately.
Yeah, I mean that, the whole idea for the stabilization, I mean, the place that we worked, the treatment facility had what they called the stabilization unit, and the whole idea for that unit wasn't necessarily for medical detox. It wasn't even necessarily for detox in general.
Yeah, that's true.
Um, what it was for was, we have what's called safe stations, which I don't even know if we have them still, but
I think they might be still around.
that's irrelevant to the point. But the stabilization unit. So individuals could go to these, safe stations, and the, fire personnel, the fire department, firefighters would do an assessment. If they needed to go to the hospital, they would go to the hospital. If they didn't need, to go to the hospital, they would then send them to the stabilization unit. And basically they would go, we would do the intake, and within 24 hours, I would say, depending on when they came in, they might see the doctor and they
Right.
might get something, but it wasn't a residential unit. It wasn't a detox. They weren't necessarily there for that purpose. It was more of a, I guess, transitional.
Yeah, I would say like a
um
temporary situation.
it was a definitely a temporary situation, and what would happen is they would meet with a counselor to figure out what the next step was for them, if they were going to go to detox, if they were going to go to another facility, if they were going to go into the residential, like where they were going to go basically from there.
Right. I mean, I guess the way I portrayed it, yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean like they're going to be like coming off the street and like, okay, hey, this is where I'm at. Like, what do I do? Like, it's more like you said, like,
They literally did come off the street, and
yeah, that's
when they
true.
showed up at the fire station, they could have used, an hour, or, 5 minutes before they walked into the fire
I mean,
station.
that is very true. It very
So
well could have been.
when they're coming into the unit, they're hurting, and they're immediately wanting, meds. And I would say at least 50% of the people that came into the unit when I was there ended up leaving before they even had a chance to see the doctor, because they didn't want to wait. And that's really, really unfortunate.
Well, and that's where that, unfortunately, that instant gratification comes into play because, like,
Yes.
that's where, this unit was, I would say, as effective as it could have been, but there could have been probably more protocols in place. But the realization is like
Yeah.
most people in a, I would say, a more treatment facility. Yes, normally in this case, what they would normally, depending on insurances and stuff, because we all know that insurances suck and it's just the way it is. Depending on what happens, stabilization might be the only option they have versus going into a detox, because their medical insurance might cover it or
Yeah.
whatever it may be.
And stabilization really is kind of like a last minute, they go to the safe station, they can get in there right away. Medical detox, you can't just walk in off the street and show up and say, "Hey, I want a medical detox." Unfortunately, like where we worked, you actually had to go to the outpatient, office, and get, kind of their assessment.
Right. And like kind of get an idea of who they are, like where do they come from, like, what is going on in their life and like
Yeah,
where
so
they at.
they would, they needed to get a full assessment. You know, Generally the people that were going into detox, they didn't stop using before they went into detox.
No, that's true.
Um the whole point of like them getting this assessment was to, for this facility to determine whether they were suitable for detox, or they weren't suitable for detox.
Right. And depending on, you know, whether how long they've used and all this other stuff and like where were they at that time, they may not need a detox because some of the withdrawal symptoms might have gone away at that point,
Right.
and so on and so forth. Um, but I was gonna say, moving on from like detox, like really the next, let's say, step, depending on where you're at, would be like a residential like side of treatment. And I know Matt actually and I worked together on the
We
residential side
did.
of the
We
house.
did. Yeah.
And the funny thing about this is that you I'm not we're not going into like, of course, full details, but like, of course, you're going to meet some interesting people and where they come from, different backgrounds, different age groups, different mentalities, and so on and so forth. So both him and I worked night shift together. And again, there's just, unfortunately, with residential, like, because let's say they came from a detox or stabilization or something like that, right? A lot of these people, unfortunately, would be up at night, right? And so so him and both of us would probably even meet each other outside. Let's have a smoke break or something like that. And they're just talking. Kind of like they're kind of going through some stuff because they realize, like, yep, now that they're sober, for, so let's say, a week, depending on how long it's been. They're realizing that what they have done in their lives, as well as, let's say, families and friends and so forth, that they're now realizing what the effects are because they're not in that mentality. They're not using, they're not, only thinking about themselves. And, I will say this, a lot of times, I mentioned, or I'm going to mention this is like a lot of guys, for example, would come up and they're like, I don't know what I need to do. Like, how do I fix myself? You know, how do I try to change certain things? I'm like, you can't. Like, it happened, right? The only thing you can do is move forward. And what is it? What is your purpose, right? Like, what is that thing that's going to make you want to stay? What's going to motivate you? What's that self guiding thing that you're going to do to make it happen? Like in this particular like situation. And so, with a residential, setting, of course you have groups, right? So you have individual counseling, you have groups, you have might have certain activities or certain games they might play or whatever. There's
Yeah.
different,
Yeah.
different counselors might have different styles and so on and so forth. So, some people might like certain ones and then, there's ones that you may not like at all. But it's one of those things that, where not everyone's a cookie cutter, right? Like you may think that everyone might be, but I was like, that's not even true because not everyone's, let's say
Yeah.
teaching style can affect, let's say that certain individual.
Well, and I mean, everybody comes with their own story, their own trauma, their own issues, and that's you have to take different approaches for each individual person, and yeah, residential, it's not going to work for every single person, and we've seen it time and time again, but it's not going to work for every individual person. But yeah, the point is, there's counseling, there's groups, but it's really for them to start learning, how do I live sober in a community with other sober people? And that's really kind of the gist of residential. And one of the I think the biggest issue I've always had with residential is it's very sheltered, right? So
Yeah.
you have a group of guys or a group of girls, or maybe it's co-ed. That gets complicated if
It
it's
gets really
co-ed, but
complicated. Yes.
you have these residential groups, men, women, they're sheltered from the community. So the community can't just walk into their unit and vice versa. I mean, yes, they can leave and get discharged. They're free to go,
I mean, they
but
would have like a family day, like usually I would say every
it was
so
I
often.
mean,
Yeah.
it was supervised. So it's not like their family just came in and they hung out and, you know, it was supervised. What I'm saying is it's very sheltered. You know what I mean? Like, so it's very sheltered and controlled environment. So when somebody does finish the program and they graduate, if they don't have something else set up for them, or even if they do go into a sober living, there's generally not as many rules in place, especially if they don't go into sober living and they just go right back to where they were living with the same people. Like the same rules don't apply to that. So everything just gets flooded right back to them, and a lot of them just don't know how to handle a lot of what's coming at them all at once again.
Well, and I think too with residential, like you were saying about being, sheltered, it it makes it harder for them to realize like what the reality is because they've been living in a false world, really. And you know, when you talk about like sober living and if they don't have like a good like support system in place,
Right.
with their family or friends or whatever, it makes it harder for them to continue on the same path because unfortunately sometimes, as we both know, they usually come back or they do other things and it involves them somehow to come back through the programming.
Many, many times, yes.
And sometimes it maybe the first time doesn't do it the trick, but maybe the second, third, so many times. But the issue is too, and I hate saying this, is where do you draw the line? When it comes to the person, because it does, it sucks because you want to help them, but if they've gone through it so many times and they clearly don't get, what they've been,
Yeah.
taught and everything, it does get to a point where you might have to look at another program because you clearly aren't getting
Yeah.
the bigger
After about
picture.
the fifth or sixth time, like this may not work for you here. You may want to go to another program even though, that person may really like it here, they're not getting taught or learning the lesson that they need to really learn here. And that's where it gets really complicated.
Right.
Um, but another aspect of treatment is outpatient.
That's actually what I was going to bring up because really, depending on the person, right? Because I mean, you can, let's say, live in a sober living, and you can also still go to, let's say, outpatient at that point because there also was a sober living house that we occasionally would go over there and visit whatever. But I know there's a couple. Of course, there's plenty around the state. I mean, I know there's a veterans like basically you know recovery home as well. Like in I think it's like Franklin. I think. Anyways, um, but the biggest thing though is like when you were talking about like outpatient and you were talking about sober living, like sober living at least teaches you like, yep, there are certain rules. There are going to be things in play that you need to one have a job. You need to have certain guidelines in place because you may think it's stupid because I mean I get it. Like you don't want it's like living with your parents. Like no, I don't want to listen to you, but maybe they're teaching you something that maybe you're not understanding at that
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
right? But it's giving you that opportunity to kind of learn and build those guidelines so when you are on your own and you have your own apartment and all these stressors come into play, you're not thinking, okay, I'm going to use again or I'm going to use different things to like substitute it. Like no, like doing that and then plus with outpatient, it of course is like residential, like the counselors wise, but it's more, you're
Well,
doing
and
these
yeah, and
appointments
that's
separately.
your what they call IOP, which is your intensive outpatient, and your PHP, which is the partial hospitalization program. And
Yeah.
those two programs are a little bit different where, IOP programs generally are like 4 to 6 hours, so they're like half days where, somebody would go in, maybe they have morning to afternoon, and then somebody else may have afternoon to early evening. Um, and it's sort of like residential, except they don't stay there.
No, they go
They
home. They go or wherever they need to go at that
right.
point. Yeah.
They go, they get drug tested, they do counseling, they do groups. They get the same sort of kind of treatment they would in residential, but it's shorter and they don't stay there. And the partial hospitalization is sort of the same except that one is all day. So it'd be
Right.
like 8 hours instead of, the 4 to 6 hours.
Right. And I mean with, IOP and like I was talking about like sober living, you know, there's of course rules in place, there's guidelines because you have more freedom now because you
Right.
have these things that are available to you and it makes it really tempting for a lot of people to oh, well, I got that buddy that I know around the
Yeah.
corner, and you can basically go over and be like, hey, I'm going to do this. Or you can say, no, I'm not going to do this because I've already learned what I needed to learn from the program. And so, sober living, yeah, it may seem like it's a lot of rules, a lot of things going on here, but at the end of the day, it actually might help you. It might save you a little bit because you're not, let's say, going back to the same situation like with your family or your friend that you lived with, for let's say 5 years or something like that, right?
Right.
It's it makes it easier for you to disassociate, and I think that's the biggest thing with a lot of people in recovery at sometimes. And I understand like we're going to talk about like the 12 steps and well, not really the 12 steps, but like AA and NA and stuff. But
Yeah.
it it's realizing that there's people in your life, right? When we were talking about earlier about like cosplay, like having that good support system. There's people in your life you want to keep, and there's going to also be
You have
people
the
that
opposite people
right,
who maybe you don't necessarily want to cut them off, but you have to have a certain level of discernment of what do these people add to my life. And if I've said it and in the last episode, like I said, I've been a counselor, so in counseling I've told people this all the time. You have to look at the people in your life and do a pros and cons list of the things that they add to your life. And when you sit back and you look at that list, if there's more things in the pro list, that's a person that you want to keep in your life. If there's more things in that cons list, well, unfortunately, like that's someone that's not going to build you up, especially when you're falling. That's the person that's not going to be by your side to help pick you up.
So Matt, am I one of those people that I like, pick you up, or am I the opposite apparently?
Eh.
Wow. For many years now, I would have thought maybe like, I might joke around with you. I might do all that, but at the end of the day, I'm only joking as in fun because I
There's more.
can.
There's more pros, John.
I'm
Yeah,
glad. I'm glad that I
there's more
have more
pros than
pros.
cons.
That's good because I was gonna say like, even though I haven't played, let's say, PlayStation in a little bit, I do care about you, even though you do remind me of Eeyore sometimes, unfortunately.
Well,
But anyways,
So the one thing about outpatient, um, that I can kind of comment on because I don't know if you know a whole lot about it.
what IOP?
Uh, which are MAT programs, which are medicated assisted treatment programs.
No, I can't comment on that.
I used to work for a clinic. That's where I was doing substance abuse counseling, and for what it's worth, methadone always gets kind of this bad rap, and I really wish it wouldn't, because methadone and Suboxone treatment can be very useful, but it takes a person with the right frame of mind who's going to put in the work for it to be successful.
So I can say this. I do remember, of course, clients in the past that would take Suboxone while in treatment, during that time. Now, Suboxone, I know, is really what it's meant for is for pain management. Like a lot of it is usually for pain management.
It can be.
It can be. I know that's one thing, but I know, like, of course, like for example, right? Unfortunately, like if someone had a back injury, right, and let's say they were taking Percocet or Vicodin or something like that, and then they kept doing it and doing it, and then they're like, that's not working anymore, for every milligram that they take, and then and unfortunately, let's say they use heroin and so forth, and so Suboxone, I understand, is like it's basically giving the opioid receptors that feeling of what it may feel like, but it's a more controlled, basically like usually a film is really what Suboxone. I mean, you can have it in tablets and other things, but it's one of those things that I know, like you were about to say, is like it can be abused. Like it can be.
Oh, it definitely can be abused, but the thing with both methadone and Suboxone, they both do the same thing. They're different. They're different medications, but they do the same thing. And
Right.
I've always kind of explained it in this manner. Like if you look at the opiate receptors, you know, and you take methadone and Suboxone, somebody who that's taking it and they're at what's called a therapeutic dose. They're
Right.
not taking too much, they're not taking too little, but they're at the dose that is, helping them with their addiction. What it's doing basically for the opiate receptor, if you can kind of picture it, is if you kind of picture the receptor as being kind of a claw. What essentially happens is, normally endorphins would kind of sit inside the claw of that is the receptor, and or if you're doing opiates, they would sit kind of inside this claw, and that's how the dopamine would get released. With methadone, if you now picture a glass sitting inside the receptor, where the methadone is still triggering the receptor into thinking it's still getting the opiates that this person is using, even though he's not, but the receptor still thinks he is. That person's brain is going to start again producing endorphins normally. And so now the endorphins are going to fill this glass, and it's still going to trigger this person's opiate receptors to trigger normal amounts of dopamine.
Now, like I said, I wasn't more necessarily bashing, Suboxone and, let's say methadone. It's unfortunate that, yes, the stigma would be like, okay, if you use it, yes, you're going to be, replacing, let's say that, the addiction or the drug itself.
Yeah.
And the issue is that yes, it can be positive. I'm gonna be honest. Like I feel like it's the personality of that person.
And it's not a permanent
Well, yeah, yes, it's not a permanent solution.
it's not a permanent solution, but there are people, and this is the one thing that I didn't like about working for, the a lot, I would say a lot of the clinics, because not all of them are for profit. There are some nonprofit, but a lot of the the clinics, especially the one that I worked for, kind of preach this like, you know as long as you're on it and you're not using, you can stay on it forever. And that shouldn't be the case. Like, you should be using MAT as a means to stop using and to learn the coping skills, you know, repairing the relationships in your life, repairing your own life, healing from your, addiction, getting yourself right. And then once you're at that point, start evaluating whether or not you still need methadone, and because coming off of these is honestly the worst part. And that's where somebody, if you're on methadone and you're listening to this, or you're thinking about it, like, you need to have a plan after this. Whether it's like, Vivitrol, if you've never heard of it, look it up. But it's a medication that can help you long term.
Well, I mean, it's like I mean, I'm gonna hate saying this too. It's like if you're, let's say, quitting smoking or something like that, right? You usually lose. Like, I can't even speak. Sorry. Like using Nicoderm or like nicotine, like gum or Nicorette or whatever. Like that would be like a hopefully a short term like solution for you to stop because you're learning how to like negate like that's bad for
Hopefully.
you. Hopefully, right? Hopefully is the key word here.
But
Uh,
I've known people that, like, they're smokers, and when you see them like at work, they're chewing nicotine gum because they don't want to go outside and smoke. And it's like,
yeah.
this is not the point of the
No,
gum, so
no, no,
that
no. You're right.
so
You're
that
right.
you can put off smoking while you're at work. Like, it's supposed to be so that you can quit, not so that you cannot go outside to smoke during your 8-hour shift.
I mean, true, but I mean, like for example, like if someone who was to quit cold turkey, like in general, no matter what it is, like I'm gonna say you're a very strong-willed person. Like there's very few people that can do it, and I've only seen very few that have actually done it successfully.
Yeah.
And whether it be, smoking or whether it be like actually like stopping like using heroin or things like that. It's hard to just like stop like automatically. And the only other thing I was gonna say is, the last kind of like treatment that you'd want to look at too, on top of this, is where that community based like groups, right? So like your NA, your AA, or Gamblers Anonymous, like all these other ones that
Yeah, Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, like, those are the big kind of 12-step. Um, those are more like Catholic based. I mean, there's a Christian based one. Um, Smart Recovery is a good one. Like, they have kind of their own kind of program, I guess.
yeah.
Um, but there are a lot of different types of groups. There's, you know, more, I guess, of the religious types. There's non-religious types.
It really just depends on your preference, right? Because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, whatever is going to help you go through, your recovery and everything else, that's the key part of this is
Yeah.
is is realizing like you have not only, let's say, hopefully a support system at home or with your family or whatever, you also have others that also can relate to
Within the
you,
community, right?
right? That can relate to you in this personal matter.
And I'll say this, like, if you or, somebody that suffers from an addiction, like, the biggest thing that you can do is putting in as much work right out of the gate as you can. If you put it off, that's what it's going to be the whole time you're suffering with this addiction. And I'd like to say, like, I haven't seen it or experienced it, but in the, almost 6 years that I've spent working in the addiction field, I can't even tell you the number of people I've talked to and had counseling with that have never put in the work, and time again continue with the same struggles over and over and over, despite telling them, put in the work. Like it's like telling your kids, do your homework. And then they don't do their homework and they fail the class. It's like if you put in the work will show for itself.
Right. It's an everyday life struggle. Like it's a constant thing that you, if you don't put, like you said, in the work, then what are you going to really get out of it? Like, are you really going to stay sober? Are you really going to like recover from this and actually hopefully learn your lessons from doing all this? Or are you going to continue the same repetitive vicious cycles that, we've already talked about? Like, that's where people need to realize, like, at the same time, there is no instant gratification. There is no, like patience is a virtue. Like, you need to make sure that it happens,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, it's all on you, man. Like,
Yeah. I
or
mean, like I
woman.
said, you have to really just put in as much work as you can, go to counseling, go to groups, go to, do whatever you need to do as soon as you can do it. Because when you're in this recovery mode, you're not going to have to do as much work as you did when you started recovery. And you're going to be able to look back and say, I really busted my hump to get where I'm at right now. And you can at that point kind of not sit completely back and
Oh
relax, but
yeah, of
like
course.
you're not going to have to do as much because you put the work in, you put the effort forth to get to the point where you're at.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, the biggest lesson that you can probably learn from just this episode is, if you're struggling, if you know people that are struggling and you realize that they're having a hard time, just reach out. Like, go find somebody, go talk to people, listen to people's stories, listen to what is going on in the community and everything else. And honestly, if you have that, that sense of mind of like, you know what, maybe I do have a problem, then it's okay to admit that you have that problem and actually go seek the right help.
Right.
And because at the end of the day, what we've already mentioned, like, you're only hurting yourself, you're hurting the loved ones that you have, you hurt all these other people that clearly mean a lot to you. And the more you keep doing that, the harder it's going to be down the road to hopefully either rebuild those relationships or even just hopefully try to maintain them once you have them back again,
Yeah.
you know?
So, in New Hampshire, like you can actually dial 211 and that will connect you to what's called the doorway, which when we were working for, the treatment place that we were working for,
Never had this.
we didn't have it. What they were creating at the time was kind of like a hub and spoke program where the doorway is really just the hub. And when you call 211, they'll do an assessment with you. They'll figure out what exactly the type of services you need, who you need to contact, if you need to fill out, sober living applications, or you need to do an assessment for this, detox facility. They'll help you set all that up. And, if you're not from New Hampshire, there is a kind of a national helpline um, through SAMHSA, which is, I don't know the actual acronym for SAMHSA, but it's SAMHSA.
Yeah, and I mean the actual hotline is 1-800-662-HELP. So 4357 is really the ending numbers, but really, like what Matt was saying too, is like, if you call this hotline, it basically gives you, it's the same thing in like New Hampshire. It gives you that doorway. It tries to point you in the right direction, hopefully wherever you live, and hopefully get you to the right resources that you need, within your communities,
Yeah.
depending on where you're at.
And that one's 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So you can call no matter what the time is. And, they will connect you, not just substance, abuse, but mental health. So they will connect you, to your local area.
Right. And we just want to mention this, guys. We support, or we always support the idea, but um, we appreciate that you guys hopefully are taking the time to listen to this episode, and again, hopefully even our bullying episode, because you know we talk about these passionate topics because we know that it's not a topic that is not, as I would say, well talked about in the in the really the communities, or even probably in a world, status, right? And so, when we have these episodes, we want you guys to hopefully share this with other people, maybe that are struggling, or maybe that somebody or
Yeah.
whatever, and hopefully they can maybe listen to this, and maybe they can be like, you know what, maybe I should go get help, maybe I should go find these resources, right? And we just appreciate everything that you guys do, and honestly, you know, we wouldn't be able to do this without you guys' love and support. And as always,
Stay geeky.